There is a phrase we use back in the country. It says, be without food, but don't be without shelter or home. Shelter is very important than food. I was working as much as you can work, like 3 jobs. Even with all of those efforts, I couldn't afford to even get a little bit time with the kids.
At the age of 16, I entered the American foster care system. I've pulled myself out of some pretty bad spots, but I needed housing, and what I was making was just not cutting it at the time.
How can a family grow and prosper if they don't have a home that they can afford in a decent neighborhood?
In the past several years, the situation has become more urgent than we've seen even 10 years ago. It has implications for people's lives.
There are so many American families that don't have enough income to afford rental housing. Half of the renters in this country are paying more than 30% of their income for housing.
The low-income housing tax credit allows investors to invest money in housing and get credits, and the result is funds to build additional low-income housing.
The Section 8 vouchers are the primary way to help people afford housing.
Vouchers are a way for a resident to get into an apartment that costs more than what they can afford with their 30% of budget allocated to housing.
There definitely would have been a lot more detours, a lot more failures, a lot more uncertainty.
Now I know that I can enjoy the life, being with the kids, and have a brighter future.
First off, I think housing is a nonpartisan issue, but I certainly believe that the bipartisan approach to solving it is what needs to happen.
Every social goal that we want for the people of the United States revolve around housing. A precondition for making progress is to have a decent place to say, tonight I'm going home to rest.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Making Every Voucher Count, Strengthening the Housing Choice Voucher Program. I'm Kristen Clearfield, a Senior Policy Analyst for Housing at BPC's J. Ronald Terwilliger Center for Housing Policy. At the Terwilliger Center, our work aims to advance bipartisan policies that address our country's most pressing housing issues. This afternoon, we'll be talking about the Housing Choice Voucher Program, which helps more than 2 million low-income families affordably rent high-quality homes at a time when housing is in short supply across the nation. But despite the program's importance, rising housing costs, administrative hurdles, and low voucher utilization limit the program's impact. We have an esteemed panel of experts today that will dig into some of the primary challenges facing the program and discuss strategies for improvement. First, I'm pleased to introduce Christy Economy. Christy is a research associate for the Turner Center for Housing Innovation at the University of California, Berkeley. Today, she'll be highlighting findings from a new report done in partnership with RAND Corporation and supported by the Cooper Housing Institute that looks at utilization in the Housing Choice Voucher Program. Prior to the Turner Center, Christy held roles with Harvard Kennedy School and the University of Oxford. She's also worked with local governments to design and implement support services for low-income families with children. Next, I'm joined by Bernard Fulton, Vice President of Legislative Advocacy at the National Multifamily Housing Council. They bring together owners, managers, developers, and suppliers of rental homes. Prior to NMHC, Bernard was Vice President for Government Relations at the Housing Policy Council. He has nearly 30 years of experience in and around Congress, including as Legislative Director for Congresswoman Schakowsky, Legislative Representative for New York City, Head of Congressional Relations for 2 HUD Secretaries, and Legislative Consultant for organizations in the private, government, and nonprofit sectors. We're also joined by Hunter Kurtz, founding partner of Gatehouse Strategies, a Washington, D.C. based advisory firm. Hunter has spent his career working in the affordable housing industry at the local, state, and federal levels. With more than a decade of federal service, Hunter most recently served as Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing at HUD. He served as the Deputy Chief of Staff at the Council of Economic Advisors at the White House, and in addition to his federal service, the Deputy Director of the City of Detroit's Department of Housing and Revitalization. Thank you all for taking the time to participate today. And thank you to our virtual audience for joining the conversation as well. You can submit questions for our speakers at any point during the conversation by using the chat function in YouTube. And we will leave time towards the end of our event to respond to audience questions. Okay, so I'm going to start today with Christy because we'll be framing our conversation today in part around how changes to the Housing Choice Voucher program could impact or improve utilization, which was the focus of your recent report. Can you describe, Christy, what we mean when we refer to utilization, and why this is an important metric for public housing authorities?
Yes, happy to. First, I want to say thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here. So Kristen, as you mentioned, here at the Turner Center, we recently published a study alongside our colleagues at the RAND Corporation with generous funding from Cooper Housing Institute on improving utilization in the Housing Choice Voucher program. And so when we talk about utilization, we're referring to the use of program resources and whether public housing agencies are using their voucher program resources to the fullest extent. So these resources are typically lumped into two buckets, budget and vouchers. So for example, if a public housing agency is allocated $100,000 for the voucher program, and then it spends $100,000 on their housing assistance payments, they're at 100% budget utilization. And separately, if they're allocated 100 vouchers and lease up all 100 vouchers, then they're at 100% voucher utilization. So in practice, these two buckets often don't match up, and PHAs are restricted by their budget utilization. So they hit their budget caps before they're able to use all their vouchers. So in the hypothetical I just mentioned, this public housing agency wouldn't be able to issue all 100 vouchers because they hit their budget cap. And this is in part, Kristen, because as you mentioned, as the cost of housing continues to rise across the country, the allocated budget covers fewer and fewer vouchers. So we can end up in a place where a public housing agency is at 100% budget utilization, but maybe only used 80% of their allocated vouchers. So tracking these utilization metrics are really important for knowing if the program is using resources to the fullest extent. And it kind of also points to this need for the budget to keep pace with rising rents so that public housing agencies are able to use all of their allocated vouchers and serve as many households as possible.
Thank you, Christy. That'll be helpful for us to keep in mind when we're talking about challenges facing stakeholders that use or implement the program, as well as when we think about solutions that could potentially improve utilization in both, I guess, primarily for voucher usage. And so I want to turn to Bernard to talk about our first challenge facing the program, which is the program's administration and its complexity, which is one of the primary barriers cited by both housing providers and public housing authorities, as well as families using the program. And as a public-private partnership administered locally across the country, the voucher program, of course, has to have overarching rules and regulations to ensure that it's implemented effectively. But even strong supporters of the program would likely agree that a more streamlined approach could improve utilization, as Christy's been talking about, and build broader support for the program. And Bernard, I would love to hear your view from the housing provider perspective, because administrative burdens is one of the major deterrents cited by housing providers as rationale for not participating in the program. So have you heard any primary reasons that housing providers are hesitant to accept vouchers, Or does NMHC have a perspective on this, or what has your membership been speaking about?
I think you hit the nail on the head when it comes to provider participation. People might think this was easy money. You don't have to worry about whether the government's going to show up with their check on time to pay for rent. Why wouldn't you want these residents? Well, it's not easy money. It's not free money. Every landlord has to spend money to make an apartment or a rental, residential rental place attractive to the tenant. But they also have to spend money to comply with local regulations, state regulations. And they have to, and a lot of those regulations go, as you might imagine, to the safety and the decency of the housing. Similarly, they have to pay for things to comply with financing requirements, like they pay for insurance to protect the property and the bank's interest. Well, just like we have to pay for those things, we have to pay to comply with the housing authorities and the federal government's requirements to get those vouchers. One big thing is inspections. Now, as you might imagine, the local government has health and safety requirements on landlords. You should know, I'd like to point out that every year, Department of Housing and Urban Development puts out what we call the worst case housing needs. It measures two things: the cost of rent burden on the renter household, and it costs the quality, and it checks the quality of housing that the renter lives in. And what that study has found is, like, of the people facing worst case housing needs, meaning you're paying way too much for rent or you live in unsafe and unsanitary housing, 94% of the families only face worst case housing needs. Their housing is actually very decent. They're getting what they're paying for. And that's because of local regulation has living standards and sometimes inspection standards to get a business license to rent out your apartment, et cetera, et cetera. I would argue that these local and state requirements are way successful in providing and ensuring decent and safe housing for residents. We still have to, however, pay for and suffer inspection process at the federal government level. And that inspection process, usually administered by the local housing authority, can take weeks or months. That's weeks or months keeping an apartment empty while you wait for them to go through the inspection process. That's a hidden cost, but it's a big cost. And it's a burden on the resident too, because they have to wait months to get the subsidy that would in turn help them pay for medication, pay for clothes, pay for food. So it's a burden on both the resident and the tenant to participate in the voucher program, on the landlord and the tenant to participate in the voucher program. And that's consequently why a lot of landlords try to opt out of it and just take the first tenant who will pay without a voucher.
Thanks, Bernard. And we'll definitely spend some more time talking about the inspections process, the hurdles that housing providers have to go through, and some opportunities that have gained some traction in Congress that could potentially improve that process for housing providers. And I want to keep with the theme of housing providers, but shift to what HUD has been hearing, because there's been a big push at HUD over the past several years to directly engage with housing providers, with landlords, to hear about their challenges when they do participate with the program, and to solicit their recommendations for reform. And Hunter, during your time at HUD, were there concerns that were raised by landlords that bubbled up to the top for you? And were there any efforts during your time at HUD to improve the program in response?
Kristen, first of all, thank you very much for having me here and talking about, honestly, one of incredibly important subject that is, arguably one of the best, if not the best, housing program out there, which is the Housing Choice Voucher, the Section 8 program. I'm a huge fan of it, but even something that's almost perfect, there's still a lot of room to make it perfect. And I think that's sort of what we're talking about today. And yeah, we during my tenure as the Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing, we did commence and we're working on a number of roundtables with housing providers, local landlords across the country. And there were a lot of themes we were hearing, a lot of them directed at the things that we were doing at HUD. Bernard has absolutely hit the nail on the head. One of the biggest complaints that we got was about inspections, because you have your local zoning code inspections, then you have the a lot of these people that are renting, or the landlords that are renting to Section 8 residents, are using low-income housing tax credits. So then you have another set of inspections there. And then you have to have the Housing Choice Voucher folks come in with their inspections. So one of the things, and other programs you might use, some home funding, other thing, all, again, we're just layering these inspections on top of each other. And I know we're going to talk more about that, but that was a common concern that we heard. The other thing was just, the HUD's ability to answer questions, provide feedback to issues that the landlords may be providing. We put together a number of recommendations. There's some great toolkits that are still up on the HUD website, talking about ways that housing authorities can work with their landlords and try to sort of improve the situation. One of the things, I'm a big fan of communication, and there's some great tools in there talking about how to have your own sort of listening sessions with your landlords, how you have that communication to figure out what their needs are, and as a housing authority and housing provider, be able to assist them and make their lives easier, so you can increase the number of people that are willing, or to take Section 8 vouchers, because it's a lot of times we, as the federal agencies and housing authorities, get in our own way in some cases of trying to provide the assistance, or try to make it easier to provide the assistance for our residents.
Thank you for that, Hunter. And I just want to encourage, if Bernard or Christy, you have thoughts you want to share in response to Hunter, or vice versa, please feel free during our conversation to do so. But I did want to turn to, I guess, the third area of complexity in the program, and that is the complexity that's facing housing authorities when it comes to issuing vouchers. How many to issue and when to issue them is really a balancing act that housing authorities are making, and they're balancing issuing too few vouchers with overextending their agency. And so I'd love to hear, Christy, from you about how PHAs managed this challenge, and if there were reforms that HUD should consider, or any insights that housing authorities shared with you during your research.
Yes, so I think, to understand this first, it's important to understand that everyone who gets a voucher is not able to use it, unfortunately. And so this is referred to commonly as a success rate. So from the perspective of the voucher holder, how many people are actually able to use their voucher and successfully lease up a unit. So nationally, this success rate is about 60%. So this means that about 40% of folks who get a voucher aren't ultimately able to use it. And there are many reasons for this. Maybe it's a lack of affordable and available units. Maybe it's landlord hesitations due to some of the reasons that Hunter and Bernard just touched on. Or maybe voucher holder difficulties applying for places and then covering the costs associated with those applications. And so obviously this is very challenging for households, but it also causes challenges for the housing authorities administering the program. They have to be strategic with issuing their vouchers, and most overissue. So they issue more vouchers than they actually have. So we've heard from PHAs, for every 10 vouchers we issue, maybe only 5 or 6 lease up. And as you said, Kristen, this kind of leads to a balancing act, or even PHAs walking a tightrope, deciding how much to overissue. If they don't issue enough vouchers, maybe they'll end up leaving these resources on the table. But then if they issue too many and too many households lease up, they can run into budget problems, and worst case scenario might have to discontinue support for some households that they offered the voucher to. So I think one thing that we can think about is like if we can make these success rates better and have more confidence that once issued a voucher, families will actually be able to use it, it could make the process more straightforward. One way to do this, I think, and we saw these with the emergency housing voucher program, is to include the service fees with each voucher. So in the EHV program, each voucher came with a $3,500 service fee that housing authorities could use to help facilitate the lease up process. They spent this on things like housing navigation, so a resource for helping these voucher holders search for units, submit applications, negotiate with landlords, all the things that make it difficult. Housing authorities also spent some of that money on landlord outreach programs, incentives, maybe helping to cover security deposits or application fees, anything that can kind of help turn a voucher issued into a voucher leased up. And so we saw a lot of successes with those. And I think one thing we could think about is expanding those to the Housing Choice Voucher program could help both households and housing authorities overcome some of these challenges with kind of the complexity around issuing.
Some of the things Christy said, and maybe give a more nuanced explanation of it. A lot of what's holding the PHAs back and issuing vouchers are actually sound like good government ideas. They are good government ideas. Like Christy touched on the issue of over issuing vouchers. If you over issue, you're more likely to get to that 100% U rated, but you're also very more likely to get to 105 or 110%, meaning you're spending money you don't have. Everyone, the entire public, all the newspapers, everyone would be going apoplectic if a PHA spends more money than they have budgeted for, right? But there are a lot of other good government things to prevent this sort of waste, fraud, and abuse. I'll lump it in that category. Before we ever get to whether they issue 100 vouchers or 110 vouchers, hoping they can get to the 100 market. Like for instance, vouchers are legally can only be spent on the 40th lowest 40th percentile units by rent, meaning the 40th cheapest units on the market. Well, that alone is going to limit your ability to get a decent place to live. Secondly, they only update this every year. Well, in recent years, the market's been moving so fast, it's hard for that voucher to keep up. That's all these good government limits to make sure we don't spend too much money on the voucher actually makes them less valuable and less attractive. And PHAs are then charged with overspend. I say overspending, but it's legal, so it's not really overspending. Instead of making a voucher only the 40th percentile loads rents, they can do up to 125% of what we call a fair market rent. That's the 40th percentile line. They can do 110 or 125, or forget the numbers, to make that voucher more valuable and to create more opportunities for them to rent landlords. This push and pull makes it very hard to navigate. And it's not all on the PHA's fault. It's not on the landlord's fault. I'll give you one big stat. New starts, meaning we developed new buildings for rent, have dropped precipitously in recent years. I think it went down 15% year over year from last year. The year before that, I think it was 30%. Landlords aren't building despite record high rents, because even at these high rents, they don't cover the cost to build. Insurance is also skyrocketing. Building materials are also skyrocketing. Labor costs, if you can even find a worker in the field, are skyrocketing. These burdens are a big deal to what's going on right now with the low utilization rates.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you, Christy. I think you've really hit the nail on the head when there are just so many factors that go into a housing market. And I think, at BPC, we definitely are of the mindset that the lack of supply is the number one driver of high housing costs. And so ultimately, we need to build more housing to drive those housing costs down and make more units available for people of all incomes, including those with rental subsidies. So thank you for that. I do want to now turn to some positive reforms that have the potential of being put in place. There was a bill in Congress that would potentially remedy some of the complexities baked into the Housing Choice Voucher program, in particular around the inspections process. And I know, Bernard, your organization, National Multifamily Housing Council, supported the reintroduction of this bill, the Choice and Affordable Housing Act. Our advocacy arm, BPC Action, has endorsed this bill as well. And while Congress hasn't enacted Choice and Affordable Housing Act to date, a condensed version of the bill was included in the Road to Housing Act, which, you know, if you're in the housing industry, I'm sure you've heard of the Road to Housing Act. We're all encouraged by the progress. It passed the Senate last month. And so can you tell our listeners what inspection provisions were included in the Road to Housing Act and how they might improve the voucher program?
Yes, this absolutely, the Choice and Affordable Housing Act would actually reduce the inspection process. Those inspection provisions are what made the Road to Housing Act. And we're very excited about all the work all the members in Congress on both sides of the chamber and both sides of the aisle have put into moving this bill forward. Hunter pointed out earlier with the inspection process is that you can find yourself inspecting the same unit over and over within a year. And approving it over and over within a year. That's because most affordable housing, even public housing, actually gets funding from multiple sources. The home program, which is usually run by the city, county, or state, low-income housing tax credit, which is run by the state. There could be other grants involved. And all of those grants want to protect their investment in the building and serve the residents who are ultimately there. And so they all have their own inspection requirements. We want to provide a unit, but we want to provide a decent unit. And not only do they all have their own inspection requirements, these inspection requirements aren't synced. And so you could find yourself, well, I did it last year. I mean, I just did this last month. And they're like, yeah, that's the home program. We're the low-income housing tax credit people. And what Choice and Affordable Housing says if one of these recognized programs inspect you within the last 12 months, everyone else can sign off and say that's a good inspection. So you go from inspection after inspection to one inspection annually. That goes a long way to streamlining the inspection process. The second provision in the bill says that a landlord can contract with the PHA to get an inspection beforehand. That means you're pre-approved, and any resident who comes up with a voucher wants to live there, instead of having to wait weeks or months for the PHA to get around to it, the PHA presumably has already gotten around to it and it's already been pre-cleared. That doesn't necessarily save the landlord money, because we still have to wait around to get that first inspection, but we don't have to wait extraordinary times, and the resident can move in immediately because they know it's been pre-approved. So these are provisions I think will save a lot of people a lot of time, which means a lot of people will save a lot of money, and it will make the program at least that much more attractive to private landlords. And we have thus far, that's why we applaud it. The provisions are great too.
Wonderful, thanks. Hunter, would love to hear your perspective. Do you, in your view, do these reforms that were included in the Road to Housing Act go far enough? Are they going to move the needle in terms of fixing or streamlining the inspections process? And if not, are there other areas that could be targeted within that process?
Yeah, thank you. And I do think that these are some great steps forward. I think there's probably more that needs to be done, but you know, as Bernard was talking about, the pre-approval is just huge. I mean, for a resident to be able to find a unit and then be able to move in almost instantaneously compared to what's now. I'm obviously not instantaneously, but we're getting there. That's very impactful on their well-being. To go to a unit, that's what we're trying to accomplish here, is to provide people with safe, decent, and affordable housing, and to be able to do that even quicker is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But at the same time, that this one type of inspection, I think, is also really helpful. One of the things we were trying to do in my time at HUD, and the process is still working, is to update the inspection process, to standardize, at least at HUD, the inspection, the type of inspections used, so that there's just one clear definition of what needs to be looked at. But also to work into that, which I think is really important, is requiring HUD and other groups to look at those standards and update them repeatedly, on a fairly regular basis, because you can't have, things that made sense 10, 15 years ago might not make sense now. Technology is changing. Something that we might be looking for health and safety reason might be some new technology may come out and surpass what we were able to do with that old thing. So asking to ensure that old thing still exists is not helpful. Looking for things that just don't make sense anymore is just a waste of time and waste of money for the landlord, the housing authority. So trying to find ways to streamline the inspection process, both for the resident and the housing authority, trying to standardize the inspection the requirements across all these programs, I think is a real big step forward, to try to just simplify this process so people are willing to use or accept Section 8 vouchers, and give those residents more options and more opportunities to find a safe, decent, and affordable place to live.
There are a few other things we'd like to see added to that. First, I completely underline and champion and thank Hunter for those ideas. We think that will make a great deal. But there, like I said, a couple other ideas. First, as you pointed out, Kristen, a lot of this problem just comes from the lack of supply. The more supply we have, the lower the rents will be, the easier for voucher holders to find a place to live that's within the government's guidelines. One way to do that, increase supply, is to decrease the cost for development. And one big cost for development is tax at the local and state and federal level. At National Multifamily Housing Council, we've urged Congress to add to moving legislation a local tax incentive program that would be housed at HUD. It would provide matching grants for every local tax incentive program, a tax abatement or a tax credit program or whatever have you, dollar for dollar. In exchange, the local government would do two things. They would invest in affordable units, similar to low-income housing tax credit levels of 20% units have to be affordable to people under 80% AMI. Additionally, they would have to review their local regulatory scheme to remove unnecessary hurdles to developing a housing. Those two things, both by reducing the amount to develop, the cost to develop, but also increasing the permitting opportunities, I'll say, to build housing, I think would go a long way to increasing supply, lowering rents, and making the voucher program work a lot better. Another idea we think that's time to be pursued is to convert the Housing Choice Voucher to electronic benefit transfer without lease or federal lease or inspection requirements. This would put a voucher holder in the same stead as any other person. If you or I, with our own paychecks, we would go to look for an apartment, we would rely only on our inspection regime. We would only rely on our ability to read and understand a lease. And that works for most of us. I don't see a reason why it wouldn't work for a resident, a Housing Choice Voucher recipient. We've seen some examples across the states, local pilot programs in Pennsylvania, Philadelphia, out in Colorado, where they just give people cash. In Philadelphia, the residents must meet voucher requirements, eligibility requirements. In Colorado, what we found is they just have to be homeless. And they've tracked things like the quality of housing they found when they've been able to lease up. And there's little to no difference between a voucher holder and these people who just get cash. I understand the fear in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse, and that's why we think it should be converted to electronic benefit transfers, EBT, something you see in the SNAP program, where vendors are pre-approved, where there's a paper trail about where the money goes and how much goes and when it goes out. But we think it's time to at least try a pilot program. And we suggested to Congress that they include both a tax incentive program, local tax incentive program that I described, and the second pilot program of converting HCV, Housing Choice Vouchers, to an EBT program without lease and inspection standards. And I think both things would prove very beneficial to voucher holders and the community at large.
Well, thank you, Bernard, for lifting those up. I know, over the past year, we've been following the direct rental assistance pilots and sort of direct cash assistance. And so that's very interesting. And also just want to thank Hunter and Christy for really getting into the program complexity. We've talked about the complexity facing housing providers, the housing authorities, and the families. And we've also come up with some, solutions ranging from, things that housing authorities can already do to some larger proposals to think about for the future. So the next challenge we'll be talking about is navigating competitive rental markets. Because one of the key features of the Housing Choice Voucher program is choice. A family should be able to take their voucher and affordably rent an apartment or a home in a neighborhood of their choosing. But with the nationwide housing shortage, the available pool of homes is scarce, and voucher holders are competing with market rate renters for these homes. And in particular, in areas with good schools and good jobs in those higher opportunity areas, voucher holders often have an even more difficult time securing housing. And so, Christy, would love to hear from your research a little bit more about what aspects of the voucher program make it harder for families with vouchers to compete in rental markets that are more competitive, have fewer available homes.
Yes, thank you. So I think probably the main thing to highlight here is something that Bernard touched on a little bit earlier, which is, the payment standards, the rent level that a voucher can cover, they're not keeping up with the actual costs of rent. And so as Bernard was mentioning, they're already benchmarked to be at the 40th percentile, which limits options. And then when the calculated fair market rent isn't keeping up with how rents are actually looking on the ground, it can make it really difficult for voucher holders to find a unit. And we heard this sort of in all contexts that housing authorities are operating in. So for example, if the average rent for a 1-bedroom in your area is $1,500, but your voucher will only allow you to rent something that's $1,200, it's really going to limit your options. And I think, Kristen, as you were kind of mentioning, there's probably also something to say here about competition. When vacancy rates are low, options are limited, and you might have 10 to 15 households applying for one unit. If the landlord perceives it as kind of difficult or arduous to work with the housing authority or go through the inspection process, like we were just talking about, or has sort of stereotypes or ideas in their mind about the type of household that uses a voucher, they're going to choose to rent to the household that doesn't come. They're going to choose, the easy path, choosing to rent to the household that doesn't come with a voucher. And I think all of those things together can make it really difficult for families to compete in tight rental markets. I think a little bit later we'll talk about some of the ways they're overcoming these challenges, but I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks, Christy. And Bernard, you did also mention the payment standard, the rents not being high enough to compete. But from a housing provider perspective, are there other challenges, other reforms that are needed that would improve a voucher household's chance of competing and getting that unit in the high opportunity neighborhood?
Maybe I pointed them out a little earlier than I should have in this conversation. But I can't say enough about increasing the number of units available by building more supply. That's a huge hurdle that doesn't just impact the voucher holder, the low income family, but it burdens everyone entirely up entire the income scale. We have communities, I've heard of communities who said, we can't recruit doctors because they don't have a place to live. We can't recruit teachers because they don't have a place to live at all, right? And so increasing supply and do whatever we can to increase supply will go a long ways towards addressing this problem, not only for voucher holders, but for everyone. And in that regard, we have to look at the tax burden. I know there are some people who are thrilled with the one big beautiful bill, and some people hate it. But in terms of housing development, it's a net positive. They basically double the amount of money that goes through the low-income housing tax credit to build affordable housing for people making 80% of the area median income or less. I can't say how big a boon that is will be to communities across the country, but we do need more. The House and the president proposed eliminating home funds. Home funds is a development program for all types of housing, not just rental housing, not just addressing homelessness, but also home ownership. And it provides a lot of flexibility on how to do that. So in theory, it could be as great a program or even better program than low-income housing tax credit. I think the only reason why people don't talk about the home program like they talked about the tax credit, because $9 billion a year went through low-income housing tax credit, where home was only at most getting $1.25 billion. Well, unfortunately, the budget proposal that's coursing through the House would eliminate that program. The Senate wants to plus it up, and I applaud that, and I hope ultimately Congress will at least fully fund and flat fund home program, so it'll be $1.25 billion in the coming year.
I think it's important to also stress building is a huge part of this. Trying to ensure that we're providing assistance to the millions of people out there that need this type of assistance. But it's in my mind, we're not going to be able to build ourselves out of the sort of the ensuring that everyone who needs a voucher or a public or some sort of assistance for housing can get one. We also need to spend a lot of time thinking about the services, how we can get people to graduate successfully out of these programs, how we can ensure that people are, basically earning their way out of the Housing Choice Voucher program or out of public housing or whatever other type of program there is. So the sort of wraparound approach, looking at all the services you can provide, how can we truly sort of help somebody use the voucher as a stepping stone to move off the program successfully to make way for someone else who needs that voucher in the future.
That's absolutely true. The program, though, has been, I think, fairly successful. If you just look at voucher households who are headed by able-bodied adults, not a senior citizen, not a person with disability, not someone we think whose working days are behind them. But an able-bodied adult, the average stay is about less than 7 years in the voucher program. Reducing that to say half would open up a lot more vouchers for a lot of people without question. And but I would say that if you're not on there if the average is 7 years, it's not the generational poverty that some people claim. It really is a stepping stone. But anything we can do to make that step that much faster would be appreciated by everybody, including the people currently on the program, the people who want to get on the program, and all their family and neighbors who are relying on them to be self-sufficient and contribute more to society.
Well, thank you. And, I think some of the support services and wraparound options are potentially things that you heard about, Christy, when you were engaging with housing authorities. Are there strategies right now that housing authorities are using to help their families break into competitive rental markets and stay housed that wouldn't necessarily, require us years of building new housing or even HUD approval, which can sometimes, take some time.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. A lot of housing authorities across the country are working really hard to help their voucher families find units. I think some of these strategies kind of involve maxing out on the flexibility that's already allowed under the program. So allowing the maximum search times for finding a place, often this is 6 months, and being generous with those extensions, using the maximum payment standard, so going up to 110 or 120% of the fair market rent determined by HUD. Some places are sort of using geographic targeting of their payment standards, so allowing higher payment standards for those higher opportunity areas to help families break into those neighborhoods. Another thing that I think housing authorities we talked to sort of consistently mentioned was trying to implement this kind of culture of customer service, orienting their staff around responsiveness, treating both their voucher holders and their landlords as their clients. So some housing authorities talked about dedicated landlord liaisons, being really intentional about, the landlords want to know when they call, someone's going to answer the phone and help us work through whatever it is that's going on. Others talked about trying to have really quick inspection times to kind of mitigate some of the challenges that Bernard and Hunter were talking about earlier. Others maybe mentioned having like those listening sessions or those information sessions be really practical and tailored. So, here's what we're looking for in the inspection process and here's how you pass it. So I think a lot of the housing authorities are really trying to think through these strategies to help mitigate that hesitancy and to make it easier for housing providers and landlords to participate in the program. And I think, there's another bucket of strategies around helping the voucher holders break into competitive rental markets, providing that extra layer of support. So housing navigation that I talked about a little bit earlier, having a staff person able to help you identify places, fill out applications, negotiate with landlords. Many housing authorities describe that as really helpful in terms of getting vouchers leased up. And then I think, well, maybe we'll talk a little bit later, but I think housing authorities are, some of them are trying really hard also to contribute to supply. And so like recognizing that there is this kind of like, both and approach that's necessary, the support and the services that we need to provide for folks who need rental assistance now, and then like kind of creating that future that we want to see where there's more affordable housing options available. So I think public housing authorities are doing lots of things. I think, the effectiveness of many of these strategies are a bit limited by the broader issue of the budget for the payment standards falling behind rising rents, but they can still be really helpful to connect voucher families with safe, suitable units.
Thanks for laying those out. Hunter, did any of these resonate with you in terms of, potentially being a good candidate for implementing across the board at HUD as part of the Housing Choice Voucher program? Or should we really, stick to the inspections and budget issues?
There were some really good recommendations in the study, encouraging housing authorities to think about the timing of when they're, the timing they're giving residents to look for vouchers. There are a lot of really good ideas in here. But I'm always hesitant to say that HUD should implement X, because look, every housing authority has, is getting pulled and pushed by a number of different factors, whether it be HUD, local issues, state issues, just the market that they're situated in. So what might work in one locality might not, probably not going to work in another locality. So providing housing authorities with the ability to, to make more decisions about how they're going to spend the funding in their community, to be able to decide how they're going to address their unique issues. Los Angeles and a small town in Alabama are not the same. And they're going to have a variety of different issues. So we've got to allow our housing authorities the freedom and the ability to address their unique issues. And some of these recommendations here probably will work in one place and not the other. And I think that's the key is, I would across the board say allow all of the recommendations of the report be usable by everyone, but just allow them to choose which ones work for themselves.
Absolutely, thanks. And I think, a lot of the innovations or the flexibilities that Christy is talking about are, able to be used by moving to work housing authorities and, BPC. We're supportive of that flexibility and think that it is really helpful that housing authorities have that flexibility to really meet the needs of their local residents. But since supply has come up a few times, I did want to give Christy the opportunity to talk about a part of the report where housing authorities are trying to contribute to supply, and that is through project basing some of their vouchers. So tying a voucher to a physical building rather than the family. In particular, if there are markets where the housing supply is short and competitive, this is one way that housing authorities are sort of combating that and ensuring that there's a unit available for their families. But it does come with costs, and so would love to hear the factors that housing authorities weigh when making this decision about whether to project base their vouchers.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the response that Hunter just gave is a great segue to this, because I think the way that housing authorities decide how much of these vouchers to project based really also does depend on sort of community needs and local context. So just a kind of a reminder, a project-based voucher is attached to a unit rather than a household. So with a PBV or a project-based voucher, the unit is subsidized for each household that lives there, rather than the house being able to take the voucher with them to where they live next. And typically, of the pot of vouchers that a housing authority is allocated, they're allowed to project base up to 20% of these. And they can be a really important tool, as we were talking about supply, to leverage additional housing development, because they do provide kind of an ongoing source of operating funding that allows more affordable housing to be built. So many housing authorities that we talked to did describe using project-based vouchers as sort of their primary tool to produce more affordable housing in their communities. And I think the way that they decide, how many vouchers should be tenant-based versus project-based really does come back to those kind of community needs. So project-based vouchers, for example, tend to serve a higher rate of single adult households, people with a disability or higher needs, whereas tenant-based vouchers are more likely to serve families with children and be used for larger units. One of the big trade-offs that I think folks talk about often is that tenant-based vouchers allow households with a choice of where to live. So they take their voucher on the private market and get to decide where to use it and where to live. I think in some places, though, with very tight housing markets, that choice can be largely theoretical because there are just not a lot of options available. So I think what we end up with is a lot of variations. Some public housing authorities maximize their use of project-based vouchers and would ideally like to use even more, while others do not. And I think, again, those decisions are based on sort of the local context. I think in particular, places with really tight markets and high rates of homelessness can benefit a lot from maximizing the use of their project-based vouchers.
Thanks for that explanation. Well, before we turn to audience questions, I did want to just touch on the government shutdown. We are in the 6th week of a federal government shutdown. And while we have seen in the past 24 hours, it looks like the shutdown may be coming to an end soon, potentially this week. The disruption in government operations does impact stakeholders nationwide, including housing providers, families using vouchers, and housing authorities. And so Bernard, we'll turn to you for this because the program relies on housing provider participation. If there are no landlords willing to rent their units, voucher holders are not going to find a place to live. And so have you been hearing from your membership? Have you been communicating with your members at all about the shutdown and the impact on the voucher program? Just curious about that.
No, only because they're veterans of prior shutdowns. We know that the voucher program isn't impervious to a shutdown, but fortunately they're forward funded a few months, 2 or 3 months. And so the deadline for opening up and shutting down the government doesn't necessarily impact housing authorities' voucher operations right now. It will only impact it 2 or 3 months down the line once that I'll call it forward funding has been exhausted. They probably also have some reserves, not the reserves they had 20 years ago because of budget cuts, but they probably have some reserves that will let them go even further than 2 or 3 months. We're only, it's the longest shutdown ever, but we're still only about halfway through that existing reserves. And so if it's true that this is about to wrap up, I don't think I'll have any complaints from my landlords. That being said, if this persists 3 or 4 or 5 months, it will, as I mentioned earlier, this program doesn't come without costs. And all of a sudden, those costs aren't being reimbursed at all. It'll be a fundamental, I think, attack on the trust between landlords and this program. And I suspect a lot of people will be looking to opt out and not take the risk of further disruption in the future.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those insights, Bernard. I know we are getting close to time. Wanted to give each of you a chance to highlight one reform or offer your insights in terms of what you think could have the greatest impact on improving the voucher program, and whether that reform would require HUD or congressional approval. So Christy, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, sure. So for me, I think what's on the top of a lot of people's minds right now is the funding for the emergency housing vouchers. And I think to me, the biggest impact would be extending that. I think right now we have about 55,000 households using those emergency housing vouchers. Many of those, were recently experiencing homelessness. I think cutting off that support can have detrimental impacts, not only on those households, but, with the partnerships that public housing authorities really diligently built up with that program with landlords, like Bernard was mentioning. Some public housing authorities have talked about maybe they need to scale back on their affordable housing developments because in order to kind of continue support to these households. So I think there's going to be a lot of negative impacts to households, to the housing authorities having to administrate all this complexity, to the landlord partners, to the pipeline of affordable housing. So I think extending the emergency housing voucher program is top of mind for me. That will require congressional action, and asking for more funding is always tricky. But I would like to point out that absorbing the emergency housing vouchers into the program would only be about a 3% budget increase to the 2025 budget. So I think it's possible.
Christy. Bernard, do you have any final insights you'd like to share?
Yeah, I really, I talked about it once already, but I think it's worth mentioning. I can't say it enough, is looking at a pilot program of providing HCV through EBT, but without the HUD lease or inspection requirements. Again, 94% of the market that's subsidized and unsubsidized don't have any complaints about the quality of the housing they're in. It's habitable, it's safe, it's decent. That's what the existing private market through the local and state inspection regimes and regulatory regimes have produced. I think the federal government can take a win and say we can rely on locally and state regulated housing to be decent and get rid of that cost altogether. Same thing for the HUD lease. Every jurisdiction in America requires a lease to rent a place. Every jurisdiction has judges and a regulatory regime to protect tenants. We don't need a federal one on top of that. Getting rid of those costs, take advantage of the existing tenant, resident, landlord regulatory regime would go a long way to saving more money to produce more housing and make a lot more private landlords interested in the program. It's time to test that out.
Thanks, Bernard. And Hunter, I'll turn to you.
Sort of touched on this a little bit ago, but just allowing more choice, allowing more opportunity for housing authorities to make decisions. They know best about what their issues are, better than we do here in DC. Better than I ever did is, running the program at HUD. The local housing authority director does substantially more about what their issues are, and allowing them the choice and freedom to make the decisions they need to make to house their residents is I think key to improving the Housing Choice Voucher program and all assisted programs.
Oh, thanks, Hunter. And I think we have time for one question. It's been just such a rich conversation, so I hope the audience has benefited from that as well. But the question I will ask is, for housing authorities that are concerned about the future of the Housing Choice Voucher program, are there strategies that you would recommend for maintaining public support for vouchers? Anything that we haven't discussed yet, or anything that we have discussed that you want to lift up?
I've spent a lot of years working for members of Congress or supporting members of Congress from outside their offices. And I can't stress enough how sensitive they are to their voting constituents' concerns. That cuts both ways with vouchers, unfortunately. Some people see vouchers, they see families struggling economically, and they think that's a bane on the community, as opposed to an opportunity to strengthen the community. But a lot of people recognize the need for housing. Everyone needs a home, no matter what their economic circumstances. And the only way you bridge that gap is through subsidies like the voucher program. I think to the extent the housing authorities can, and I know it's a very difficult issue for them, that housing authorities are, and their staff are hired because of what they know about providing housing, not what they know about politics. And so it's a strange and scary place for them to go. But to lift up the voices and benefits of these programs and highlight them as much as possible so that the voting public is on their side and on this program side is the best thing they can do. Do their job, of course, and make sure the housing is decent and a boon to the resident and neighbors alike, but also make sure that they let their elected officials that about all those benefits as well.
So you invite your elected, congressional delegation to come see what you're doing.
Yeah,
I think that's key, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what affordable housing is and what the housing choice voucher is, and let people see that this is fundamentally changing people's lives and making their lives better. So,
Resident and tenant alike.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah,
Resident
like
and
just
neighbor alike. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, demonstrate that. Be proud of that and show your delegation, the exciting work that you're doing.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful and hopeful note to end on. It is about the people that are being served by this important program. And I just want to extend my thank you to Bernard, Christy, and Hunter for taking the time to share your expertise. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. I hope this was a helpful conversation for you as well. And please stay up to date with our BPC's housing events and programming in the new year. So thanks so much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.